Gonzaga may not have an argument as the best college basketball program of the past 25 years, but they should be higher than where they were in CBS's latest ranking.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Friday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode is brought to you by Mazda, folks. Just like there's more to every player, more dedication, more attention to detail, there's more to a Mazda vehicle. Stay tuned later in the episode for highlights in this week's Moving the Game Forward segment, Mazda, Move and Be Moved. We got a handful of updates for you all today to get you into your weekend. Four-star forward has listed Gonzaga in his top 6. We'll talk about that at the end of the show. Evan Miyakawa's fantastic preseason team and player rankings and projections are out on his website. So we're going to talk about where Gonzaga showed up in those rankings, where those players are in the rankings, and things that we think maybe are not quite so accurate on those projections. We'll get to that in the second segment. But before we do that, we are leading today's show talking about a pair of articles written by Kyle Boone at CBS. Kyle, a friend of the show, has been on Locked On College Basketball with us in the past, and he did a couple of articles, first ranking the top 25 college basketball programs of the past 25 years, starting in 2000 and going forward, so the Mark Few era of Gonzaga basketball. And then his other article was kind of the opposite of that, looking ahead. Who does he project to be the top 25 college basketball programs over the next 25 years? And we're going to talk about where Gonzaga showed up on those lists, because they were on both of them, as they should have been. But I think there's some debate as to their location on those lists. Gonzaga was number 10 on the ranking of the best college basketball programs over the past 25 years. They finished behind Duke, Kansas, UConn, North Carolina, Michigan State, Kentucky, Florida, Villanova, Syracuse, and then Gonzaga at number 10. So that does mean that Gonzaga was ahead of 4 teams that did win national championships in the last 25 years. That would be Louisville, Maryland, Virginia, and of course the team that beat Gonzaga in 2021, the Baylor Bears. Gonzaga also ends up ahead of Arizona, UCLA, San Diego State, and Houston, among, of course, many, many others as well. Now, the Zags, however, are not 10th over the last 25 years in terms of total wins. They are in the top 3. Only 3 programs in this time period have had over 700 wins. Those 3 programs would be Duke, Kansas, and of course, Gonzaga. Obviously, and it goes, we won't say this 25 times over the rest of this segment because we only really need to say it once. Gonzaga has played a weaker competition in the past 25 years in conference play than everybody else on this list. The WCC, over again, especially in this time period, has not been nearly as strong as the ACC, the SEC, the Big Ten, the Big 12, the Big East, any of the power conferences. That is not up for debate. The WCC has gotten stronger, and some of those conferences have gotten weaker, but in that time period, it is not close. And I do think that that is an obvious and important caveat in this conversation. However, it does not mean that Gonzaga should automatically be deducted so many points for the success that they have had in this time period. To be clear, I am not going to argue Gonzaga deserves to be over any of the following schools. Duke and Kansas, very obvious. They should be the top 2. They are the top 2. There's no debate there. I will not argue Gonzaga over UConn because they have 5 titles in those 25 years. 5 more titles than Gonzaga. There's no other argument needed. Same with North Carolina and Florida. North Carolina has 3 titles. Florida has 3 titles. Yes, Florida's overall success over the last 25 years doesn't really match up to a program that has 3 titles, but that doesn't matter. They still got 3 of them. They deserve to be in that conversation. I also will not argue Gonzaga over Villanova. Villanova has 2 titles. Villanova has over 600 wins in the Big East. I don't think there's a compelling, strong argument for Gonzaga over Villanova. That leaves Michigan State at number 5, Kentucky at number 6, and Syracuse at number 9. So let's do a little comparing here. Sweet 16 appearances over the last 25 years, Michigan State and Kentucky each have 13. Gonzaga has 12, and Syracuse has 11. So Gonzaga right in the mix with those schools in that category. Final four appearances, Michigan State has 6, Kentucky has 4, Gonzaga and Syracuse each have 2. National championship game appearances, Gonzaga, Kentucky, and Michigan State all have 2. Syracuse has 1, and then wins, Kentucky has 1, Syracuse has 1, Michigan State and Gonzaga each have 0. And then, of course, total wins, Gonzaga is quite a bit ahead of everybody else, 716 wins compared to 651 for Kentucky, Michigan State with 617, and then Syracuse down at 579. So ultimately, arguing Gonzaga over Michigan State is going to be tough. Do I think that Michigan State, who has the same number of titles as Gonzaga, who has gone to the same number of national championship appearances as Gonzaga, do I think they should be 5 spots higher? That's potentially up for debate. But 4 more appearances in the Final Four, a very, very rigorous schedule throughout the Big Ten. I think Michigan State gets the bump. Kentucky is going to get the bump. They have a title, sure. They deserve the title. Obviously, the SEC has not been this super powerhouse conference for the SEC for Kentucky for most of the last 25 years, but it has been much better as of late. However, I have a really hard time finding the argument for where Syracuse belongs ahead of Gonzaga. Obviously, there's one key thing that Syracuse has that Gonzaga does not have, which is a national championship. They came back in 2003 on the heels of an incredible, extraordinary freshman season from Carmelo Anthony. You give them that? Fair. Absolutely. However, Syracuse has not been good, at all, in the last decade, half of the time that this 25 years spans. And Syracuse has made the tournament 5 times in the last 11 years. That's it. And 3 of those 5 times were as a double-digit seed. Once as a 10 seed, twice as an 11 seed. One of those times they did make a run to the Elite 8 as a 10 seed, so they do deserve some credit for that. But they've only made the tournament less than half of the last decade. That is not good. They've only gotten a single-digit seed 2 times in the last half of this time period. To me, that just does. Gonzaga's made the tournament every single year. And yes, you could flip the argument and be like, well, if Gonzaga was in the Big East or the ACC back in the first half of the decade, they wouldn't have made the tournament every year too. Sure, I suppose that's probably true. But if the only argument you have for why Syracuse belongs ahead of Gonzaga is they wouldn't have been as good in this hypothetical situation, that's just not a very strong argument. And I think that the national relevance is kind of where the tiebreaker is here. Like if you wanted to use they have a national championship as the tiebreaker, fine. Can't really argue with that, obviously. But I think that the argument that Kyle used in his article is that Syracuse has, they were so great early in the year and they just have this kind of national relevance as a brand. And I just feel like that has fallen. I think Syracuse made a big mistake leaving the Big East to go to the ACC. I understand why they did it, but in terms of their basketball, it has really curbed that program's success. They are not a nationally relevant basketball program right now and have not been since like 2016. And so for me, Gonzaga, while they were not as relevant in the first half of this time period because they were still kind of this new up-and-coming fledgling Cinderella story, they have been a national part of the echelon for this entire 25 years. It has steadily climbed where Syracuse has went up and then cratered off of the cliff. But at the end of the day, I think Gonzaga has been more part of the national conversation and more discussed part of college basketball over the past 25 years than Syracuse. And I'm not sure it's that close. And to me, I think that wipes out the fact. The Gonzaga is making more Sweet 16s. Gonzaga has more NCAA tournament appearances, more wins by over 150 or about 140 or so wins. More wins, more Sweet 16 appearances, more Final Four appearances, or more Elite 8 appearances, more national relevance. All of that, in my mind, wipes out the one championship that Syracuse has over Gonzaga. Is it that big of a deal? No. Would Gonzaga being 9th change things dramatically? Not necessarily. I think you could probably make arguments for some of the other schools, but they would fall a little bit flat just because, as we talked about with Michigan State and Kentucky, they have some things, that Gonzaga does not have. Kentucky's got the title. Michigan State's got a much more Final Four appearances, but I do think that Gonzaga deserves to be a little bit higher on this list. Boone also wrote the article, like I mentioned, that projected the next 25 years. And we're not going to spend as much time on this because it's just guesswork. Like there's no disrespect to Kyle. He's a phenomenal writer, but it's just like trying to pick apart something like this when it's really just a fun exercise is a little bit silly. Gonzaga came in at number 21 on this list. Mentioned Mark Few's age at 62 and mentioned the concern about what's going to happen to them when Mark Few leaves. I've never subscribed to that concern as much as others do, but I do. It is a relevant part of the conversation for Gonzaga. He also mentioned the NIL in their ability to continue to compete, which again for me is odd because I think Gonzaga is in a more advantageous spot. And it'll change. Everything will change in the next 25 years. It'll change in the next 3 years. But right now, we're expecting Gonzaga is going to have something in the ballpark of $9 to $11 million annually from their from the Pac-12 media deal, and they're going to spend 80% of that money, presumably, on their men's basketball program. I expect that some powerful programs like Kentucky and Michigan State, and of course Duke and Kansas and all of them are going to spend more than that on their men's basketball programs. But the idea that Gonzaga will not remain competitive financially with other men's basketball programs in the NIL era is honestly just not a take I subscribe to. Until it is proven that they are unable to compete, which has not been the case, until it is proven that they are financially just completely unable to buy the talent that they need to compete, I will continue to believe that Gonzaga is actually in a better position going forward than they have been over the past 25 years. Well, we'll have more conversations about this. This is a fun topic. It's just kind of a fun off-season thing. But what I want to do now is switch gears and talk about another projection system, another kind of article that mentioned Gonzaga. Evan Miyakawa, fantastic college basketball analytics site. Their updated team and player rankings came out on Thursday. They're really high on Gonzaga's front court. No surprise there, but they're a little off base when projecting Gonzaga's backcourt. We're going to talk about that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, this episode is brought to you by Mazda's Moving the Game Forward. For those who believe it's not just about playing the game, it's about redefining it. There are moments that do more than put points on the board. They move crowds, move culture, and keep the game moving forward. And this week's moment that moved the game forward for Gonzaga was the return of Mario Saint-Superi back from Spain, back on campus, fired everybody up to see him post that picture of him back in Spokane. The long off season's coming to a close, and Mario being back on campus just makes it feel even closer. So when you follow what moves you, the unexpected, well, it's only the beginning. And just like there's more to every highlight, there's more to a Mazda vehicle. Mazda, move and be moved. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And we're moving on from our conversation about the 2 articles written by Kyle Boone at CBS Sports to instead talk about the preseason team and player projections that came out at one of my favorite analytics sites in college basketball, Evan Miyakawa. It's EvanMiya, MIYA.com. Phenomenal stuff there. And the rankings came out. Gonzaga comes in at number 16 in Evan's preseason rankings. And this is pretty consistent with where the computers and where the people, the actual humans, have ranked Gonzaga coming into the season. John Rothstein has Gonzaga at number 18 in his preseason top 45. Bart Torvik, another computer model, has Gonzaga a little lower, has them at 24 in his system. Gary Parrish, who has not updated his top 25 in a while, he's at CBS. He has Gonzaga 21, but it was in mid-June, so it was before they even got the commitment from Mario Saint-Superi. So 16 feels about right for this roster. Obviously, the computers do not know this, but for us, not knowing the status for Tyon Grant Foster is obviously a huge hinge for Gonzaga. And then the computers also are looking at a team that has some roster continuity, obviously, in not only Graham Ike and Braden Huff, but also Emmanuel Innocenti and Ismaila Diani, but also has a lot of new faces and faces who sat out a year, which can kind of be wonky for the system. I've joked with Evan about this before, and I'm hoping to have him on to talk about this more in depth here soon. But Gonzaga tends to make these computer models work extra hard. Their roster construction is always just, it deals with things that are a little bit tricky for a computer to be able to articulate. The things that I would, and again, Evan would speak to this much more eloquently than I will be able to, but the things that this system has seemingly struggled with are international players, which is understandable. When you're, projecting a model, you can give the model, here's the freshman ranked by 247 or on 3 or whomever, and the model can generally project out how well they're going to do based on their rankings. That's much more difficult to do when you're trying to compare a 18 or 19-year-old coming over from Spain versus a 22-year-old coming over from Bosnia versus a 20-year-old coming over from Italy, and they're going to different teams, and they're going to different systems. Like, it's really difficult to rank. And then the system also punishes players who sat out a year, which I think is understandable. But in Gonzaga's situation, because they're one of the very, very few programs that utilizes red shirts to get players better, the way they did with Braden Smith, the way they did with Jalen Warley, the system doesn't really know what to do with those players all that much. And then you have a Steel Venters who's missed 2 years in a row, and it's just a little bit chaotic. So the player rankings, I mean, there's 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 players that are ranked 1 through, whatever it ends up being, 5,000 or so different players. And for Gonzaga, some of them are pretty good. Some of them I think are obviously, the system is struggling to understand what to do with said player. Let's put it that way. That'll be the polite way to phrase it. Graham Ike comes in at number 14. That feels great. He is an All-American candidate coming into the season. He's valued very highly by Evan's system, always has been. So too has Braden Huff, who came in at 37. That's very high for Braden. We have really high expectations for Braden, and I think justifiably so. But for him to finish as a top 40 most productive player in college basketball would be a tremendous, extraordinary result for Gonzaga. However, after that, there's a big drop. There's not a single other player on Gonzaga's roster that is ranked inside the top 150 among all players in college basketball. The next player on the list is Braden Smith, Gonzaga's new starting point guard, who comes in at 169. And after that, there's a very big gap and a surprising player coming in at number 4 in Gonzaga wing Emmanuel Innocenti, who is 290th in all of college basketball. If you were to ask 10, 15, 30, 100 different Gonzaga fans to name their top 4 players on this upcoming roster, and I say this as somebody who loves Emmanuel Innocenti, who talked him up all of last year, he's not going to be on anybody's list. He's not. He's a good player. He's a great defender, but he is not. If he's one of the 4 best players on Gonzaga's roster, it is either because he took a massive, just nearly incomprehensible leap offensively, or it is because the rest of the players on this roster that we're expecting big things from do not perform well. The likely scenario where Emmanuel Innocenti is the 4th best player on the roster is probably not good for Gonzaga. In fact, it might be very bad for Gonzaga if that were to happen. Tyon Grant Foster's next at 389, and I get the system's going to struggle with him. He was really good. He was really good 2 years ago. WAC player of the year, 20 points per game. One of the best scorers in college basketball. He was really bad, not really bad, but he was not nearly as good the following year. His age, the fact that his performance ticked down, I can understand why a computer model might be hesitant to consider him very good, but 390th or 389th is a pretty rough spot for him to end up. I'm going to rapid fire through the next couple ones here, and we'll talk about the ones that clearly stand out. Next up is Steel Venters at 581, Adam Miller 596, Davis Fogel 600, Mario St. Superi 610. Huge jump, huge gap. Parker Jefferson is next at 1,494th. Jalen Warley is next at 1,861. And then Ismaila Diani is after that, 1,947. So Parker Jefferson, again, no disrespect. In fact, I'm recording this on his birthday. Big old happy 19th birthday to Parker Jefferson. He's not going to be a more productive player this year than Jalen Warley or Ismaila Diani. Jalen Warley particularly very much surprises me. I understand why the system doesn't really get Ismaila Diani. He played 66 minutes last year. He was an international freshman the year before that. There's not a lot of data for a computer model to scrape to figure out Ismaila Diani. We know he's going to be better than that, but the system, I get why it's struggling there. I also get why the system's struggling with Mario St. Superi. If you look up any international player, Neo Avdilas at Virginia Tech's like in the 400s. Luka Bogovac at North Carolina, he's in the 500s. This system does not really know what to do with international players who have yet to play college basketball. So I get that. Mario, obviously going to be better, going to play more than Davis Fogel, who is a few spots ahead of him, is going to be a very impactful player for this program. Same with Ismaila Diani. But Jalen Warley spent 3 years playing college basketball at Florida State. Yes, he sat out last year, and yes, he's not a super impactful player offensively, but he averaged 7 points per game in the ACC as a starter. I cannot understand why a system like this would barely have him among the top 2,000 players in college basketball. It to the point where it feels like there's maybe something wrong here. Like there's some error in the data, because Jalen Warley, especially like Emmanuel Innocenti, averaged barely a point per game last year. He comes in the top 300. Jalen Warley, who is a similar player in the sense that he is a good defensive wing who does not score very much, Warley's a similar player who has been more productive in a tougher conference and is over 1,000, close to 1,500 spots lower than Emmanuel Innocenti. That doesn't make any sense to me. If you were to redo this and you were to give Warley a ranking that's more similar to what he should be, which is probably like in the 300s somewhere, maybe even higher, and you were to give Mario a ranking that makes more sense, suddenly this roster would look a lot better. Now, again, other teams are having similar issues. Again, North Carolina would need a redo because Luka Bogovac is going to be much better than the system gave them a grade for. But it's just one of those things where the system really likes Gonzaga and really likes a lot of the things that they do, but is also struggling to figure out what to do with some of Gonzaga's players as well. I'm really excited to see how this shakes out. Obviously, we are expecting much better things for players like Grant Foster and Mario and Jalen Warley in particular than how this system is projecting them. I suspect Emmanuel Innocenti is probably not going to finish this season as one of the 300 most productive players in college basketball, simply because I do not think he will play enough to be in that conversation. I also don't expect Davis Fogel to finish in the 600s because I don't think he's going to play very much at all either. So there's going to be some movement up and down in this system as the year goes on. But a huge shout out to Evan for putting this together, for generating these rankings. They're always, it was like Christmas for me on Thursday. I was just going through them, clicking on different teams, clicking on WCC teams, kind of looking through and finding out how this computer model projects this conference to go this year. It was a lot of fun. Big shout out to Evan for doing this. And again, just looking at Gonzaga's schedule, it's really kind of a fun way to lay this thing out. Again, Gonzaga comes in at number 16. They're playing 3 teams in the non-conference that are ahead of them. Kentucky's at 10, UCLA's at 11, Alabama is at 15. After that, Oregon's at 24, Creighton's at 32, Oklahoma is at 37, and Maryland is at 51. So a lot of teams, so 7 teams basically inside the top 50, with Maryland just missing that cut barely. And then looking at the WCC for this year, pretty strong stuff for the West Coast Conference. Gonzaga, of course, at the top at 16. St. Mary's comes in at 43. San Francisco at 55. Santa Clara at 87. So 4 teams in the top 100. After that, you get Oregon State at 123. LMU at 129. Shout out Seattle U coming in next at 138, ahead of Washington State, who is at 154. And then you get Pacific 196, San Diego at 215, Pepperdine at 262. And then the Portland Pilots 313 is where they come in on these rankings. Well, folks, Herly Brutus, a 6'5" small forward from Florida, is visiting Spokane for Craziness in the Kennel. We knew that. He's also listed Gonzaga among his top 6 finalists. We're going to talk about what it might take to get him to Gonzaga and why the staff is so enamored with him, coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, it's the weekend, and it's time to look back and crown this week's MVP on Who Delivered, powered by DoorDash. Just like you can win every Saturday with DoorDash Streaks, saving more money every time you order, these players delivered when it mattered the most. So let's break it down. For the Washington Huskies last week, running back Jonah Coleman delivered in a big way. Coleman had 5 rushing touchdowns on just 15 carries against UC Davis. When the pressure was on, Coleman came through. No hesitation, no delay. And just like Coleman delivered for the Huskies, DoorDash always delivers on your Saturdays. With DoorDash Streaks, you can save every Saturday you order. Stack it up all season, and you could save up to $250, including $100 in DoorDash credits. Order this Saturday, keep the streak alive. Feel your game day only with DoorDash. Terms apply. Promo ends November 18th. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we are closing out the show and the week talking about Herly Brutus. Herly Brutus, 6'5" small forward from Florida, like we mentioned. He revealed his top 6 finalists on Wednesday. I believe it was Wednesday or early on Thursday. The final 6 schools that Brutus will be considering, Gonzaga is on the list, as well as Utah, LSU, Kansas State, St. Louis, and South Florida. Brutus is, of course, as I mentioned previously, set to visit Gonzaga for Craziness in the Kennel. He will be in Spokane October 3rd through 5th, with Craziness taking place on Saturday, October 4th in the afternoon. Brutus is going to be on campus alongside 4-star center Sam Funches, who has been a priority recruiting target for Gonzaga for well over a year now at this point. For Brutus, he already took an official visit to St. Louis back in late August, and he has a visit scheduled at Utah for October 9th. Gonzaga is very much hoping that Herly Brutus will take his visit to Spokane and will not end up taking that visit to Utah. They're hoping to get a commitment from him on campus before he leaves on October 5th, and then will end up, obviously, if he does make that commitment, he will end up canceling that visit to Utah a few days later. Again, 6'5" wing from the Villages in the Villages Charter School in Florida. He is 141st in the updated 247 Sports rankings, which is a lot lower than he was previously, also a lot lower than where he comes in on other ranking services. For example, On3 has him 89th in the 2026 class. Meanwhile, ESPN has him 82nd in the class. So a very big difference, a 50-plus spot difference in the rankings between 247 Sports and both ESPN and On3. Part of the reason he was lower on 247's rankings is that he did not play due to injury during the July evaluation period. There's only a certain amount of time per year that you're allowed to watch these high school players and evaluate them, and a huge chunk of that time this summer, Brutus was unable to play. Why that meant that a place like 247 moved him down so significantly and other places did not, that's a question you would have to ask for the people there who do those rankings. It surprised me a little bit. I know that Gonzaga has been very invested in Herly Brutus. They view him as a player that a high priority for them. Anybody they're bringing on campus for Craziness in the Kennel is pretty clearly a high priority for them, so no surprises there. Brutus is a really strong defender. He's considered one of the better wing defenders in this entire class. He has a super high motor. He's very long, very athletic, and the offense is still developing. And I do think that that's part of the reason that he is lower on some of these rankings, particularly 247's, is that the offensive game is fairly limited at this point. He is effectively able to use his athleticism to score in transition, to get downhill in half-court sets and get to the rim and score that way, because he is a very good athlete and is a better athlete than most of the people he is going up against. That will change getting into Division I college basketball, but right now that's the majority of where his offense comes from, is as a hellraiser out in transition and in a straight line driver to the basket in half-court sets. But he's a great defender. He's switchable. He can guard 1 through 4 already. He's got the length, the athleticism, the motor, the drive to be strong on that end of the floor. We've seen Gonzaga prioritize wing defense quite a bit the last few years with Emmanuel Innocenti and then Jalen Warley. Tyon Grant-Foster is a strong wing defender. And Brutus, out of the recruiting class here, is somebody that they're looking at to be a point of attack defender at the next level as well. So Brutus, one of 5 visitors set for Gonzaga these next couple of months. One of them, Ethan Harris, just wrapped up his official visit to Gonzaga. That was September 9th through 11th. 4-star forward from Camas, Washington. And then Brutus and Funches, as we said, are set to be on campus the first weekend in October for Craziness in the Kennel. Week after that, Gonzaga is going to host Luka Foster, one of the strongest offensive wings in this entire recruiting class. He's going to be on campus October 11th through the 13th. And then about a month after that, Gonzaga is hosting consensus 5-star Cameron Holmes, 6'6" wing from Arizona, the younger brother of former All-American Dayron Holmes. Cameron Holmes is going to be on campus November 8th through 10th. He will be at the Spokane Arena for Gonzaga's game against Oklahoma, which Cameron just visited Oklahoma very recently. So Gonzaga would love to get a big old W against Oklahoma at the arena for a lot of reasons, but partly because Cameron Holmes will be in the house and they'd love to convince him to come out to Spokane for his college career. All right, folks, I'm going to leave you with this for this week as we get into the weekend here. In case you missed this story, The Athletic, which they posted this and they said it as our college football staff writers ranked the best college bars in America. and their top 10 rankings released on Thursday, and it was 9 football schools or 9 bars situated near football schools, but slotted in at number 6 on the list was the Great Jack and Dan's in Spokane, Washington. Of course, the home of the Gonzaga faithful for over 100 years. Jack and Dan started in 1909. It wasn't named that until 1975, but it has been continuously serving alcohol since 1933, which is when Prohibition ended. This is not the first time Jack and Dan's has been on one of these lists. In fact, 20 years ago, in 2005, Sports Illustrated did a list of the top college bars in America, and Jack and Dan, was number 6 on the list back then. So 20 years later, huge difference in Gonzaga's popularity. In 2005, they had only really had the success that they'd had for a half decade or so. Mark Few was still very young in his tenure. Adam Morrison had not had his explosive junior season yet. And already Jack and Dan's was considered one of the best sports bars or college sports bars in the entire country. 20 years later, Gonzaga's now been to national championships. Mark Few's been an Olympic coach. Like they have the 3rd, 4th most players in the NBA. Like this is a completely different Gonzaga program. And yet Jack and Dan's still showing up on the list. And there was a phenomenal quote, I'm just going to paraphrase it here, in that article from 2005, interviewing Jack Stockton of Jack and Dan's fame. Jack Stockton is also the father of John Stockton and grandfather of David and Laura Stockton, who all played at Gonzaga. And Jack Stockton said in 2005, he said, this bar, like I owned this bar was a popular place before my son even picked up a basketball. Like before John was even an iconic Gonzaga player, Jack and Dan's was already a stalwart. And that quote is so applicable that it came out in an article in 2005, well before Gonzaga was what Gonzaga is now. It was like the kennel had just been built. And now 20 years later, Jack and Dan's is still on that list. And this quote from Jack Stockton rings even more true. Like this bar was here before John Stockton was even famous. This bar was here before Mark Few was even born. And now Gonzaga has had this meteoric rise. And yet Jack and Dan's still, like it was 20 years ago, like it was 50 years ago, is still one of the most premier college bars in America. That may never change. Gonzaga may lose their threshold where they are and fall down. If that ever happens, Jack and Dan's will still be there through it all. That is their promise, and you can tell that's going to be the case for them going forward. That's going to wrap it up for me today. If you're out in Spokane, go have a pint at Jack and Dan's. See if you can make it work. It's going to be a fantastic time, as always. I want to thank all of you for making this show your first listen and your first watch of the day. Give a special shout out to those everyday listeners as well. I'll be back next week for you all. We'll keep you up to date on what's going on with the recruiting for Gonzaga. Keep you up to date on the rest of the roster. Hopefully get an update on Tyon Grant Foster here very soon. We'll have all of that and more coming your way soon. Thanks again, folks. Have a great weekend. And of course, as always, go Zags.